Fall of Eagles is a 1974 BBC drama covering the narratives of the Habsburg, Hohenzollern, and Romanov families through the late 19th century to the end of World War I. Created by John Eliot, the series dramatizes events like the unification of Germany, the suicide of the heir of Austria-Hungary, and the First World War. Some highlights include Patrick Stewart's portrayal of Lenin, Kurt Jürgens' performance as Bismarck, and Barry Foster's depiction of Wilhelm II. The series follows the internal experiences of the ruling families of the three empires, how they affected their nation's political developments, and how, at the end of World War I, they were overthrown. Some of the best episodes of the series come at the beginning of the show. These earliest episodes portray the tale of Princess Victoria, daughter of the more famous Queen Victoria, as she marries the Crown Prince of Prussia, the future Emperor Frederick III. This story, little known by many people, is one of the most interesting events of alternate history. Had their tale unfolded in a more auspicious way, the 20th century would have been radically different. Germany would have become more open, representative, and republican, would have had better relations with Britain and America. It wouldn't have found itself as isolated on the world stage. With a diplomacy that wasn't so bellicose and alienating, the First World War, and the second that followed it, may not have occurred. In real history, Germany was unified under the reign of the conservative emperor, Wilhelm I. This was accomplished due to the political skills of his chancellor, the statesman Otto von Bismarck. Appointed to his role in an autocracy, Bismarck had an audience of one, only having to answer to his monarch for his actions. Under this system, Bismarck was effectively able to govern an entire nation by himself, and as a skilled diplomat and practitioner of realpolitik, he was able to shape the future of Europe through his acts of intrigue. The period of his reign is one of the most unique eras of history, comparable only to that of Richelieu under Louis XIII in France. In the prior decades, German nationalism had emerged as a liberal idea, calling for the disparate states of the German Confederation to unify into one nation. While countries like France, Spain, and England were already unified under the idea of the nation-state, German history had resulted in them being divided amongst a plurality of smaller states. Though originally a liberal idea associated with constitutionalism and republicanism, German nationalism eventually assumed a kind of universal character, and Bismarck appropriated it as an idea of the conservatives. While in 1848 the liberals wanted to unify Germany as a constitutional monarchy with a strong parliament, they had been defeated by the reactionary politics of their time. And while the German states were unified by the Zollverein, or economic union, Bismarck wanted to weld them together into one nation. He sought to do this not through a peaceful, gradual constitutional process, but through, as he said, blood and iron. He navigated Prussia, which had built a powerful modern army under the guidance of Helmuth von Moltke, into the Schleswig-Holstein War, the Brothers' War with Austria, and the Franco-Prussian War. Craftily, Bismarck was able to frame Prussia as a defensive power in most of these conflicts, while at the same time holding a confidence of victory due to Prussia's formidable military. In Prussia's war with Denmark, solidarity with Austria was established, and the Germans living under Danish rule were liberated. Bismarck then had to defeat the other German-led state, Austria, in a conflict that would expel their influence from Germany. After instigating Austria by preventing it from administering Holstein, Austria was defeated in 7 weeks. After this victory in 1866, the northern Protestant states united with Prussia in the North German Federation. Bismarck then provoked a war with the Germans' ancient enemy, France, who had long antagonized them in conflicts like the 30 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars. Though today we have the stereotype of the militant Germans, at the time this didn't exist. In fact, the Germans were often the victims of the French. While Prussia had a long military tradition, the Germans would only embark on their campaigns of aggressive conquest during the Great War and World War II. Bismarck used the question of succession in Spain, stating he would support a Hohenzollern ruler of the country to provoke a conflict with France's romantic, emotional emperor. With the French declaring war on Prussia, Bismarck was able to summon the smaller German states to Prussia's aid. After the Battle of Sedan, Napoleon III was captured. Bringing the Germans together in a defensive war elevated the concept of national unity, and in 1871 at France's Versailles, the victorious Germans came together, unifying Germany and proclaiming Wilhelm I as emperor. This Kleine Deutschland, or Little Germany, was dominated by the Protestants. This instilled values like discipline and industry into the new nation. The Germany of Bismarck excluded Catholics, Germans who lived in Austria, those in the borderlands of Czechia, as well as those in Poland, the Baltic, and Eastern Europe. Though the national issue was settled in the short term, the idea all Germans could be unified in a Grosse Deutschland, or Greater Germany, was something that would happen during the Second World War. Without Bismarck, Germany may still have unified, but in a slower constitutional process, and power may have been more devolved, like in a federative system like the German Confederation. Crown Prince Frederick, though a military commander and a war hero, wanted to achieve unification like this through a process of peace. Despite this, he would serve with distinction in Bismarck's wars. The show portrays the unique genius of Bismarck. In one scene, which takes place during the Austro-Prussian War, the War Council and Wilhelm's advisors encourage him to march on Vienna after defeating the Austrians at the Battle of Königgrätz. With the king's other advisors outruling Bismarck, he takes a drastic action and goes to the window, threatening to jump out and kill himself if the king doesn't listen to him. Committing a histrionic temper tantrum and breaking a vase, he settles down and recollects himself. In an instant, he transforms into a statesman, cool and collected, and lucidly explains why they need to leave Austria intact, so she'll be neutral should they have to wage another war later. The Crown Prince sides with Bismarck on one of his rare occasions, and with his support, the king concedes. Bismarck would often conduct himself in this way, bullying, pleading, crying, or using any other kind of persuasion to get the stubborn Wilhelm I to submit to him. Due to Bismarck's political uniqueness, this led to success. Princess Victoria was an idealist who embodied the ideas of England, favoring a limited monarchy, deference to Parliament, suffrage for the people, and constitutionalism. On arriving in Prussia, she founded an alien culture, lamenting how it was a nation of the barracks, constantly drilling and devoted to war. If we look at a map, we can see the geographic origins of these countries' psychologies. Britain as an island needed a navy to maintain its security, but Prussia as a continental power without physical boundaries, like the mountains of the Alps or Pyrenees to protect it, needed a strong standing army to maintain its independence. In this, we can see the meaning of the quote, "Geography is destiny." England famously didn't maintain a standing army. Back during the English Civil War, this was one of the disputes that emerged in the conflict between King Charles I and Parliament. Wanting to emulate the absolutist monarchies of continental Europe, the king sought to establish a permanent army, which would have increased his power and undermined the rights of legislators. His defeat allowed power to devolve, causing England to shift toward representative government. While its standing army made Prussia formidable, despite its military tradition, it nearly experienced a collapse in the 7 Years' War, saved through providence when the Empress of Russia suddenly died and was replaced by a pro-Prussian ruler. Turning back to Frederick and Victoria, their marriage was a happy one. They were devoted to each other and experienced a great union of intellectual interests, similar to that of Albert and Queen Victoria. They planned to model their own reign on those of Victoria's mother, doing for Germany what her marriage did for England. Frederick and Victoria had 8 children, including 4 sons, not facing the issue of succession that plagued other monarchs. Their eldest son, though, the future Wilhelm II, would not develop a mature character. While Victoria wanted to name him Albert after her father, Frederick insisted he be named Wilhelm after his. He accordingly became a conservative like his grandfather, later becoming close with Bismarck and distancing himself from his parents. One of the great dramas of the show is a conflict between Frederick and Bismarck, with Frederick supporting pacifism, the constitutional process, and parliament, and Bismarck supporting war, ruled by fiat, and absolutism. Divided by ideology, it would have been interesting if, in another world, they were able to cooperate. In a previous video, we talked about Jonathan Haidt's theory of the moral taste buds. It's clear that the moral systems we're born with trap us into prisons of belief, alienating us from others whose ways of looking at the world we can't comprehend. A major event in the life of Frederick occurred over a speech he gave in Danzig. Bismarck had extended censorship in the country, restricting people's rights to free expression. The Crown Prince publicly denounced the minister-president, and in a public forum, censored his father for his reactionary politics. Though this heartened German socialists, constitutionalists, and liberals, who made up a significant plurality of the country's population, it angered Wilhelm and resulted in Bismarck taking steps to completely cut the Crown Prince out of politics. Though he remained the heir, a military commander, and the future emperor, while his father reigned, it was decided he would be completely excluded from any positions of political influence. The Crown Prince and Victoria also started to be spied on by the country's secret police, who viewed their politics as subversive and pro-British. Frederick still represented Germany at Queen Victoria's Jubilee, and for a period chose to spend more time in Britain, where he and his wife's politics were accepted. At the same time, Bismarck cultivated a close relationship with Wilhelm II, including him at the Foreign Office, and raising him for a future role in politics. This upset his parents, who had been cut out of these positions by the conservative establishment. After Germany was unified in 1871, the public was granted a parliament, suffrage, and political parties. However, power remained consolidated in the hands of Bismarck. As time proceeded, many educated Germans hoped that the country might follow England in its path of social development. Thus, the marriage of Frederick and Victoria was a great hope for them. The English themselves, Anglo-Saxons, were a Germanic people who had emigrated from Saxony and Jutland to Britain in the Dark Ages. Ethnic kindred of the Germans, during the Victorian period when ethnology began to develop as a discipline, many felt an alliance should develop between Britain and Germany. Though Britain always preferred its splendid isolation to being bound to the fate of the continent, there was a sense of kinship that grew between the Germans and the English. Had Frederick and Victoria gotten to rule Germany in earnest, there could have been a different fate that unfolded, where Britain and Germany became partners, not suffering from the foolish rivalry that developed because of Wilhelm II and his clumsy foreign policy. After over 40 years of monarchical stability under Wilhelm I, who lived to the chagrin of liberals to the age of 90, in 1888 came a sudden sequence of successions. Early in the year, the geriatric Wilhelm I finally died, and the Crown Prince, now aged 56, at last acceded as a sovereign of Germany. For a brief window of time, it appeared the dreams of liberals, constitutionalists, and pacifists in Europe would be realized, and the German government would reform itself along a republican model. Now that he was emperor, Bismarck's efforts to politically marginalize Frederick would be defunct. Regrettably, this happened when Frederick was in extremely poor health, having been diagnosed with throat cancer 3 days before taking the throne. He was bedridden, repeatedly operated on by doctors who sought to rescue him, while Victoria tended to him devotedly. During this period, Frederick confirmed Bismarck as chancellor, who ruled the country during his illness. He also attempted to broker a compromise between Victoria and Frederick, hoping they might be able to get along now that he was the monarch. Bismarck recommended they call for the best surgeon in Europe, an English specialist on throat cancer named Morrell Mackenzie, to operate on the emperor. Visiting his clinic, he initially diagnosed the cancer as benign, before changing his view of it to malignant and operating on it. One operation cleared much of the cancer, though it then returned later on. As the emperor became increasingly sick, he lost the ability to speak and began to communicate by writing messages on a board. With his prospects looking increasingly bleak, Mackenzie told Victoria of her husband's bad prognosis, something that was not communicated to the emperor himself. In one of Frederick's last diary entries, he wrote, "What's happening to me? I must get well again. I have so much to do." And in another lamentation about losing the ability to speak, he said, "I cannot die. What would happen to Germany?" As his condition worsened, he became confined to bed, lost the ability to walk and eat, and began coughing excessively. Finally, 99 days after coming to the throne, the cancer killed him. The premature death of Emperor Frederick is one of the most tragic events in history, and one of the most fascinating points of divergence of modern times. He was a unique figure whose healthy accession to leadership of Germany would have changed the 20th century. Frederick was thoughtful and humane, the lawful sovereign, and a proud Hohenzollern. Unlike his father, he was a liberal and a constitutionalist, and with his English wife, planned to reform the system of German government. He passed one decree limiting the power of the chancellorship, which went unimplemented due to his illness. On his death, the throne passed to his son, Wilhelm II. Wilhelm was insecure, immature, and undiplomatic. He didn't have an insight into politics or geopolitical strategy. He became grandiose and would often say wildly inappropriate things that would alienate Germany from its partners and allies. At the same time, if we go into Wilhelm's childhood, we can discern some of the origins of his behavior. Doing so lets us view history in its complexity. Wilhelm II was born with a deformity, with one arm slightly longer than the other. This caused him to struggle to ride a horse, something that was necessary to prove one's masculinity in an aristocratic society. Wilhelm tried to hide his deformity throughout his life, trying not to draw attention to it in portraits. Never receiving full acceptance by the Prussian military, he developed a sense of insecure masculinity. If we want to identify the origins of the Kaiser's eccentric behavior, we might find it here in his young adulthood. It's true Victoria was disparaging toward Wilhelm for his disability, which negatively affected his development. His insecurity could have caused him to become megalomaniacal, to compensate for the internalized feelings of deficiency. Still, it's unfortunate that Frederick was such a thoughtful and capable politician who never had the chance to rule. Meanwhile, his son, thought immature even by his mother, rose to a position of imperial power. At the same time, as emperor, with all the privilege that came with it, there was no excuse for William not to take the time to become more learned, disciplined, and cultivated. He had the ability to consult with professors, statesmen, and diplomats, or with brilliant figures like Bismarck, who he could have emulated if he was humble. But Wilhelm instead chose to believe in his own self-willed grandiosity. As a young man, he had been sent to the Foreign Office in the hopes that spending time in the diplomatic corps might have made him more prudent, but this did not occur. One of the most ironic scenes occurs after Wilhelm II comes to the throne and decides to fire Bismarck. Firing the individual whose politics created the German Empire, because you think you can do better, shows something fundamental about his character. Ironically, once Wilhelm II took power, Bismarck changed his politics and began to appeal to constitutional limits and on the old edicts decreed by Wilhelm I. Unfortunately, having spent so long trying to amass power in the hands of the monarch meant the same abilities went to his successor. Bismarck made constant appeals to maintain his influence, even going to Victoria for support. In their meeting, Victoria smiles wryly at the Chancellor, though not without some pleasure, explaining that at Bismarck's own doing, she's lost all the influence she might have had over her son. The sacking goes through, and Bismarck finds himself out of government and in forced retirement. While Bismarck followed a policy of war and realpolitik in uniting Germany, After 1871, he had devoted himself to peace. We can recognize in his firing by the Kaiser that he did indeed stand for good government. After the Franco-Prussian War, he had dedicated himself to being an honest broker, identifying Germany's interests in maintaining peace in Europe and preventing a conflict from breaking out between the great powers. He partially restored the concert of Europe system that had existed previously, maintaining the difficult balance of staying allied with both Russia and Austria at the same time, who constantly feuded over their interests in the Balkans. The Russians sought to expand their influence there under the ideology of Pan-Slavism, while the Austrians, having lost their influence over Germany and Italy, sought another area to dominate in their ambition as a great power. Bismarck said, quote, "In a game of 5, you want to be on the side of the 3. He let Britain maintain its policy of splendid isolation, alienated France and kept her friendless, and used common conservative values to keep Russia and Austria friendly via the Three Emperors League. With Bismarck out of power, and Wilhelm lacking any diplomatic grace, Germany gradually drifted toward isolation. The country's economy became increasingly ascendant, outpacing Britain in industrial production and threatening them by building a navy. Germany's military became the largest and highest quality in Europe, creating fear that in a war it could defeat any one of its neighbors alone. While Bismarck scorned colonialism as a waste of time, Wilhelm II sought colonies in Africa and East Asia, inducing new conflicts with Britain and France. He also allowed the alliance with Russia to come to an end, resulting in the country forming a new alliance with France, which encircled Germany. The idea of war ended up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Wilhelm's actions left Germany without potential partners, until it found itself faced up against the Entente in the First World War. Fall of Eagles dramatizes one of the most unique events in history, the tragic premature death of Frederick III, whose reign, had he lived, could have transformed the events of the 20th century. If Frederick had been able to reign, Germany could have reformed itself internally, adopting a constitutional government and becoming closer partners with Britain and the United States. With a more mature foreign policy, leadership by a peace-loving emperor, and stronger relations with Britain via Empress Victoria, we may not have had a First World War, and without it, also the Second World War, the Holocaust, and the Cold War.